I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And I'm very happy to be joined by Father Stephen McKenna. Hopefully, you recognize his face by now. And he is continuing a series that is called, or kind of going into the errors of modern philosophy. So I guess the errors of modern philosophy with Father Stephen McKenna. I guess that's what we're going to call this series. And today, he's got a really good one. And last time we talked about kind of the basics of philosophy. What is philosophy? And went all the way back to the Greek philosophers. And by the end, my head was kind of overflowing with, I don't know what it was, but with something. And I went back and actually watched part of it again, especially the second part. And it was something that I needed to watch twice. There's so much information. It's so good. It's so much to learn. And it's so important. And today, we've got the basics done. So we're going to start with some of the errors. So Father's going to talk about hedonism and Stoicism. Now, you've probably heard at least one of those words before. So I think you're already getting a little intrigued. And I was too, as soon as Father told me this is what he wanted to talk about. So Father, without further ado, thank you so much for coming on and for doing this series. And I'm excited for the show.
Oh, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Yes. It's funny that we have, I guess what you'd say, like errors of modern philosophy as the show. And we're starting out today with an error from before the time of Christ, or two errors from before the time of Christ with their origins. But that's something that I wanted to just very briefly say is that the way I'm interpreting modern errors of philosophy for this show is that more with the focus on errors that we find still prevalent in modern society that are effectual to us, not necessarily that they were developed in more modern times, but that they actually are pertinent to our modern times. And these two, hedonism and Stoicism, not exactly polar opposites, but can be viewed sort of as near opposite to each other, are both really important to understand in our time. And when we see it rounded up in the end, the goal is to see that, the where the Christian is finds himself in between the two, that and having aspects that are in addition to what is merely offered by these two ends, that as we talked about before on let's say Thomas Aquinas, whose feast day it is today, very pertinent that we record on his feast day. Yeah. So that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about, that moderation, that middle road being where we find sanctity. And so I think this is with these two schools of thought, it's kind of gives us that understanding and flavor for it. There will be other errors that we'll come to later on that you don't necessarily have that same type of tie-in, but for this right now, we can see that. So, so to start, we'll start with hedonism. That the school of hedonism comes from Greece, and it's from Aristippus of Cyrene, and is who was considered the father of the hedonistic schools of thought, the original forefather of having an actual organized philosophy of hedonism, and that it is widely just referred to as the Cyrenian school after him, that comes up in order to differentiate from a school of hedonism that came afterwards, and we'll see and contrast that in just a moment. But it was Aristippus of Cyrene that was this first forefather in it. And what hedonism tells us is that it is man's actions. It's a form of ethics, that man's actions we act in order to gain a specific end, that we are seeking after in our actions a common goal, and what is the right way of going about, not only what is the right goal to have, and what is the right means of going about it. This is how we consider ethical questions. With hedonism, it is the goal is pleasure. That is the universal and ultimate goal, is to seek pleasure as an end itself, and that it's to be understood as Aristippus explains that it's not just sensual pleasure, but although that is certainly contained in there. And what we mean by sensual pleasure is pleasure that can be felt from the senses. So when you take a warm towel out of the dryer and you place it to your face on a cold day, that feels really good. And so, the hedonist would say that if you were taking warm towels out of the dryer and you were constantly searching after the most pleasure, well, of course you would place it to your face because it feels good, and that is a good in and of itself. That feeling of that good feeling that comes from it, that you're taking in through your senses. But it's also to be understood that it includes the senses of pleasure that are not. It includes pleasure that's not just sense felt as well. So it's mental pleasures, enjoyment of certain things, contentment in aspects of life. Um, these things are not dismissed by the hedonist philosophers as not connected. They are to be considered and taken into account, and to be really part of that decision making. That I would search after something that brings me pleasure, either by feel or by mind, and so I would do that. Would be what I would seek after. Now,
and Father, real quick, I'm sorry, is that so? Maybe you're going to get into this, but did that have any supernatural effect or eternal effect, or was it just purely, hey, let's have a good time now because there isn't an eternity? Was it kind of a atheistic view?
That's a good question. It was sort of viewed, these both schools were not atheistic per se, but their viewpoint was not of either one of their viewpoints or ends is not an eternal one. So both hedonism and Stoicism in general, this is it's a very generic application of that. So yes, it is largely naturalistic because it is serving the maximum pleasure in this life. Where it becomes, in their mind, somewhat not naturalistic is that you have to remember, especially with the Greeks, there's a lot that to be considered pantheistic with it. That essentially in pantheism is that everything around us is God, or it contains God and things like that. And so what they do is both schools talk about that good to be sought as either nature or even what is divine in a sense, because that they likened the natural ends to the supernatural have a supernatural connection. So because which makes sense in a very pagan world, that you sort of have all of this sort of baseness to what should be a higher plane. If we're considering gods, we should be having a higher understanding of that. But when you're polytheistic, it ends up becoming necessarily sort of base and naturalistic, because of the fact that if you go to its real ultimate end in the opposite direction, obviously you end up having one God, because he has to have infinite power, and you can't have that with this naturalistic and pantheistic idea. So that's why there's sort of these gods are in and controlling aspects of nature. And so a lot of times in the writings of both the hedonists and of the Stoic, you'll have them saying that you're following nature, you're following what is, divine and things like that, and because it is a very naturalistic understanding of it with a minor supernatural connection. If that makes sense, does that?
It does. Yeah, it's interesting, Paul. And did they come after this hedonism? Did it come after Aristotle or before?
Hedonism comes as a school originally, I think, before Aristotle or near to that time. You have to remember that it probably, like, I don't have the exact dates for Aristippus of Cyrene, but you have to remember that whole entire, the thing that's sort of unique about when we talk about the Greeks is as a general application of thinkers, is that they were really the first ones to develop true philosophical schools. And so you end up having these various schools and these various figures that happen near and about the same time, because that was very much a in vogue type of thing for society, that you had these schools of learned men that went around and spent their whole entire day just thinking and proposing ideas and everything. And so that sort of like 4th century BC, 3rd century BC, that time frame, you end up having a lot of overlaps of a lot of different schools, because that was really the first societal swing to have schools of academia, men of who just operate in this world where they weren't going home and plowing a field at the same time. They spent their whole entire days just sort of walking around and thinking and writing and lecturing on these things. So there's a lot of that overlap in them. But as for like exactly in the time frame, I would say probably a little bit before, because it seems that hedonism would leave out one. I'd have to, like I said, Google search it to make sure for sure. But I'd have to. But I think that because it leaves out a very important aspect of Aristotelian thought, which is true deductive logic, that it would predate Aristotle in that way. But I'd have to check it. There's one thing you'll learn about me, Kevin, as we go along, is that I'm not very good at remembering dates. So that's
fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I understand.
Feel free to ask, but I might not have a clear answer. So that's fine. But yes. So anyways, returning back. So the end that they were seeking is this all-around pleasure. Now, there comes a secondary school that comes later on afterwards, a school of Epicurus, who himself is also a hedonist and starts his own way of thinking, but he advances pure hedonism, which is just seeking after pleasure, to a more rounded hedonism, which is to say that there's an understanding in Epicurean school, the Epicureanistic school, that pain and self-restraint, which we think of as the opposite of pleasure, if that's what we're seeking after, that pain and self-restraint are sometimes both prudent and even sometimes necessary for ascertaining even greater pleasures in life. So where Aristippus starts, it's almost pure animalistic type of desire, although containing some aspect of like self-contentment and things like that in there. But very much based in this, you want it and you think it's going to make you feel better, go and do it type of mentality. Then Epicurus comes along and he betters that and says that, well, sometimes you have to suffer a little bit to have, or work a little bit to get something even greater. So instead of, if maybe you have to, in order to have, yes, you could eat, But if you wanted to have nicer foods, then sometimes you might have to put more effort and focus in your agricultural practice or your meal preparation, and it might take more work to have something that is more preferable. Or like I said, sometimes even bits of pain are necessary for a greater good. So think of childbirth as an example of that. The pain itself is still undesirable of childbirth, and it's viewed by the hedonist as bad, but the joy of actually having a baby and having this new part of your family and everything supersedes that. And so by going through the pain, you get this greater reward in the end. And so under Epicurus, he recognizes that sometimes a little discomfort or pain or sacrifice is necessary to attain even greater goods than the initial desires. But still, the maximizing of good is the end. And for both schools, the best way I've ever seen it described was from a professor that I had in college when I was a philosophy student. And he talked about hedonism sort of in this way to illustrate it, to make it very easy to understand, is almost if you think of it as having like pluses and minuses. So you would take the measurement of units of pleasure. And he called them hedons. So for hedonism, that if we could, if I were to, let's say, go try to go skiing, right? So I'm going to go skiing, and the amount of hedons, the amount of units of pleasure that I get is 157. And then I look at it, it's like, okay, well, in order to decide should I go skiing or not, I would also look at it and see what the units of displeasure would be that go along with the same action. And so then he called those dolors, units of pain. And so then I look at the dolors, and it's, sort of aspects of like, well, my muscles might be sore the next day, and I could be a little bit cold at times, and, maybe I might fall down it once or twice, and, then snow might get down my coat or something like that. And I realized that, okay, the dolors are 27 in measurement, units of dolors. Well, that gives me 130 points of pleasure greater than not pleasure. And so I can look at and compare it to like, well, if I just sort of sat around and did nothing today, I would have more fun skiing than I would not skiing. And so therefore, it's a worthwhile decision. So that would be the basic way of understanding how hedonism works, maximizing pleasure while understanding, and especially under the Epicurus school, that understanding some negatives might be there, but as long as it creates the greatest amount of pleasure sort of net at the end, then it's the right choice. From that, the hedonism ends up then breaking. So if we look at Aristippus then to Epicurus, it's sort of like one school there, and then another man builds upon the idea to make it a greater, more for all-consuming idea towards actions. Then it breaks it to two branches, though. Now we have what is called egoistic hedonism, and then on the other side we have altruistic hedonism. And the egoistic hedonism is that the greatest goal or the greatest good is the searching after your own personal pleasure as the highest end. And the altruistic idea has the happiness of the whole as its ultimate end. So egoistic makes sense when we think of egotism, and things like that. It's, how much good time am I going to have? And then the altruistic is how much is the collective universe around me, who's going to have the most benefit from that. And we see that they even had modern philosophers who still embodied these ways of thoughts. In the egotistic side, we had Thomas Hobbes, and the altruistic, which was more prevalent, we end up having a number of them, including people like J.S. Mills, and and both continue to play parts in our society, and both are problematic for different reasons. The egotistic, again, sort of, we come back to this base natural animalistic function. I'm just trying to do whatever makes me feel good at all times, in all ways. And the altruistic contains this sort of socialism idea that comes along with it, which is why in modern times it's a more prevalent school of thought, that it doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter my own personal connections to anything. It just matters that it creates the greatest good, highest number of hedons to the lowest number of dolors in society as a whole. So to show a differentiation, it would be, we can look at the true examples of what we would consider truly problematic in one example for each one of them. So if we see the problems, we can understand where it falls short. So in egotistic hedonism, the idea of, say, somebody who is so selfish, and their pleasure is sort of is more off base than what we consider societally acceptable. In that sense, the serial killer's actions make perfect sense, and under the hedonistic system would be something that would be deemed to be at least be an ethical action based on their own personal interpretation of wants, desires, passions, and pleasure responses. Now, most people would look at that and say it's disgusting. How could you ever do that? But you have to remember, it's egotistical. So it doesn't matter that it causes pain to the person who's the victim. It doesn't matter that there's families that are really destroyed over that. It doesn't matter that even society is affected by somebody who is doing these things. All that matters in that instance is that the man, the actor himself, the acting agent, he receives the greatest amount of pleasure. And if that's giving into that base, creepy, base, desire of being a serial killer, well, that's for him, that is the most correct action to take. On the opposite side, the altruistic side, we can see why it would be problematic from, again, an example that exposes, we can understand it better, by using an example that exposes some of its problems. So in the altruistic side, it's, like I said, everybody taken into account as a whole, who does society, does the humanity, does it receive the most pleasure? Is it best for everybody as a whole, the decision to be made? Well, in that situation, we could see a situation like this. For instance, you have a family, so let's say that for this scenario, you're what's your oldest child? Is it a daughter or son?
Girl, yeah, daughter.
Yeah. Okay, so your daughter, she contracts a horribly rare disease, right? And it's so rare that there's only probably, say, a couple of cases that are discovered every year. But it is treatable, but the treatment is just as rare, if not more so. Now, there are two people, twins, in the United States that also contract the same disease as your daughter does. The problem is that there's the treatment is the events are so rare that the treatment and it is so new that there really is only one known treatment there now, and it happens to be located in Germany. And the person comes to you and says, "Well, here we have it. We have one vial of this medicine. Once it's opened, it has to be used right away. We can use it to save your daughter's life, or we can send it to America, and it once it's open, it's plenty to be used for two people. We just can't do both because as soon as we open it, we have such a short period of time to use it that we can't. We have to choose one or the other." Now, under the altruistic hedonistic viewpoint, you would have to choose to have the vial sent over to America because, well, that's two people, and that's double the pain of loss, if you will, or at least some level of increase in the pain of loss for that family, and things like that, and for the pain for the children. However, it completely devoids of the fact that you have a personal stake in that. You have a closeness of relation. You also, as a father, have a certain level of responsibility as there as well. That this is not just some random person. This is somebody whom you are in charge of. That you are entrusted with their safety and their upbringing and their growing and everything like that. So we can see the real shortcoming in altruistic hedonism by the fact that it is completely devoid of any kind of personal interaction to go along into that thing. Like I said, it is that communist idea. It's that idea of, well, that we all saw too often utilized against us during COVID times. That idea that every single one of us has to shelter in place because it might save one person's grandma from dying. We all have to lose our jobs and our businesses, and we can't do the things that we like because ultimately at the end, if it saves a life, well then is that too much of a price to pay to save a life? Well, yeah, I think a lot of people would say yes, it is. People die all the time, and it doesn't make that responsibility my responsibility necessarily. So we can see the problem with altruism under the hedonistic point as well. Now,
well, sorry, real quickly, Father, it's just interesting because it really brings up a story for me that I was an English teacher for a while, and I taught these two young ladies, and we talked about faith, and they were both atheists. And so I was just curious, and we got into the conversation about faith and atheism, and I was really curious. I was like, okay, so if you're an atheist and you both seem like fine young ladies who seem to be good, and decent people, why? Why be decent? What's the point? I mean, what's the purpose of being good or doing good or being responsible and working and etc. And I think that your answer for altruistic hedonism, that sounds a lot like kind of what they would answer you, kind of the well, it's because for the greater good, for the people who come after, for Joey in Chicago, and Lynn in China, and all these different things like this, but without any actual basis. Kind of a strange thing, because I think without any supernatural mindset, obviously, because they're atheists, but just kind of with a somehow it's all kind of connected in this ultimate good of pleasure in a way. And so that's really interesting, because I never heard of that. But that sounds like kind of how they answered it. I wonder if they even knew that.
It's interesting. It's interesting too, in fact, because the reality is that altruistic hedonism, I think, more or less really only exists conceptually. And ultimately, if we are left to hedonistic design, it ends up having a more egotistic expression in life. So if you take those two girls, for example, that there are aspects of following societal norms, following the laws, being generally, having some morals and manners and things like that. But if there is no real true moral guiding compass for the individual to do that, it's usually self-centered as to what they're going to gain out of it, even in their altruistic actions and thoughts that they have. So it's, if you think of in terms of if you talk to somebody who gives to charity, for instance, or volunteers at a soup kitchen or any of these type of things, but they have no supernatural motive for it, what is the thing that they usually say why they do it? Well, it makes me feel good to help out other people. And so while I think there's an understanding, I'm not saying that those actions are bad. They're not. Of course, it's good to help people, even if it is for you. There is an aspect that comes into the equation that is personal gain. It's this understanding that it's not completely selfless most of the time. There are some people that can, put that into action, but then that ends up sort of more coming into like that Stoic idea that we'll talk about in a moment, because because at the end of the day, the focus of the hedonist is on maximizing pleasure, and the pleasure that they most relate to is their own pleasure, their own desires being fulfilled, their own base wants being satisfied. And so even in those altruistic actions, a lot of times it has it comes back to many times an egotistic reaction. Why follow the laws? Well, because it's I don't want to get arrested and I don't want to get penalized ultimately at the end of it. Or I like order, that order is something that is good. And so, it's rewarding in that regard. Then, or because if I follow laws, then it also means other people have to follow laws, and as a society that makes everything safer and better. And why? Because have this self-interest in my own preservation and my own safety in my neighborhood, and my own not having to worry about cars going 150 miles an hour by me or something like that. There's a lot of believed to be and even conceptually altruistic ideas, but a lot of times it breaks down in the end to being self-serving, because hedonism is really it is really run by the passions, and really run by the emotions, and by the pleasure, and measuring that pleasure. And like I said, most of the time we are too nearsighted to see, if especially without any kind of supernatural connection, to see the effects in a much larger scale. It is only when we have the time to step back and see it outside of the situation itself that we can conceive of greater good. But usually our good is pretty localized in this naturally occurring.
Well, and it seems like, Father, that it seems that there's just an immediate hole in, especially in egoistic hedonism, that it's pretty obvious that if you're always giving in to your desires and your carnal lusts, I suppose that it always has an effect, an ill effect. I mean, if you always eat what your body says you want, you say, oh, there's a cake, there's a cake, and you eat it,
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get sick, and then you're going to get fat,
Yeah.
and then you're going to get unhealthy, and then you're going to die. And obviously that works with all these different things. So it's
Sure.
It's interesting that there's a philosophy that can even last, because it's, especially when it's uncontrolled at all, which seems like hedonism in many ways almost has to be kind of uncontrolled, because that's kind of the point. It just seems like, well, it can't work, and it can't bring actual happiness, right?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because in the end, it is what really probably plagues our society so greatly today. So the difference being is that I think the thinkers of hedonism both extrapolate it out to its furthest end, right? They bring it out to truly being the only consideration taken into effect for your decision making, and secondarily, that they are going about it in explaining it in an actual thought process that takes place. Because in reality, the society that we live in is today so dominated by passions, by feelings, by emotions, by base carnal animalistic desires. And that is all around us. We as a society choose to follow a hedonistic route because it is the path of least resistance. My base animal instincts are self-interested. It is why if you have a hungry dog and you put food in front of it, it doesn't have reason at all. And so it is going to try to get that food all of the time, unless you give it like by interaction of some sort of punishment or reward system, which is what we call training. Unless you give it a real reason that is, affecting, it's an equal passion acting upon it that is, that is forcing it to act differently. Unless you give it that reason, it will go after that food 100% of the time if it is hungry when you put it down in front of him. So when we think of like animals, they act very hedonistically and egotistically. That's why a cat doesn't have any moral qualms or any kind of reservations or squeamishness in slowly torturing a bird to death. It does what we can't really fathom because it is purely self-interested. It enjoys the hunt, it enjoys the play, and it enjoys the kill and the eating. That's it. And it has no thought whatsoever as to how the bird feels about that at all. And so the more removed from God that we get, the more animalistic we tend to be a lot of times. And because we are sort of suppressing the operation of the supernatural soul, the will. We talked about that in the first episode. And so we look at modern society today, and what do we see? First off, it's completely self-indulgent, modern society, especially in younger generations where it's not meant to be offensive against younger people, but it's just a clearly observable thing that our society has been going in this type of trend, and now more than ever, because it's really facilitating it, it's turning downwards much more rapidly into this sort of hedonistic society. And so it's completely self-indulgent. It's why we see people so obsessed about themselves in the world that they're constantly taking pictures of themselves, and they're putting out filters on cameras to change their appearance in certain ways, and that people become obsessed about comparing themselves with other people more and more so. And it's why people are oftentimes very depressed, and then allow that depression to really build upon themselves, because depression is inwardly looking, that we are focused on our own wants or our own insufficiencies, or where we lack and things like that. And so whereas before people had a better understanding that it's okay that depression comes, but it's something I need to work to overcome and work to fight against and work to bring myself out of, and it's less and less so that now. So now you end up with suicide being a real problem, because people just get so depressed and despondent because they can't stop thinking about themselves at all in that way. It's also why the LGBT alphabet soup of unnatural immorality is so prevalent, because it's feelings. Well, today I feel like a lady. Well, I don't really care. It doesn't make you a lady. Well, that's how I feel, and that's how I identify. Well, that's what in this idea of hedonism is going to cause my most pleasure. It's the it effeminizes society. It bolsters up laziness. It creates this world of not wanting to work, but to gain, to have instant gratification. And our society supports this more and more. In fact, you cannot escape it today, because the very idea of entertainment and selling of products and everything, it is geared towards this lowest common denominator. They use special effects in camera work for commercials, and to create dopamine releases in your brain that make you want to desire that. The blue light that's in this video that we're doing right now, it helps to create dopamine releases. And so it's if you ask somebody, what is it easier to do, watch this video or read about this stuff in a book, or to go pray simply a rosary or something like that? It's easier to do this. Now, that does not mean that's always bad. Obviously, we're doing the show. That's not a bad thing. And I much rather people utilize their time that they're going to have in recreation watching things by benefiting from it. And that's why we do the show. But we see that reality, because how many people talk about putting on YouTube or the television or whatever, and they fall into like this vortex of time where it's, that all of a sudden several hours have passed and they don't know what the heck really they were doing or why they were just around it. But now it's all of a sudden it's late at night and they haven't, done what they needed to do.
It's crazy, Father. I had an entire era, unfortunately, of this time in my life. And I remember there were times where you get so much into that, watching TV or your phone or whatever. And I remember specifically times where I was sitting there watching something and thinking, I don't like this. I don't like this show, and I'm watching it. It was unbelievable. I can remember it, consciously remember doing this, and it's totally insane. But I couldn't. I was so addicted to it that I just had to sit there and watch it, even though I'm like, I hate this show. It's so bizarre, crazy.
And we see even the entertainment that we get, basically the masters of that know that's how they trap us. That's why Facebook has developed the metaverse, because you know what, why would you strive after becoming something that's hard to attain if you could just pretend to exist as that real thing? Why pretend? Why have to work really hard to gain money to have a nice house when I can just put on these goggles and all of a sudden I'm in a nice house, and I'm a race car driver and I have a beautiful artificial girlfriend, and this all these hedonistic ideas of life become realities that hey, just because I'm the everybody gets a trophy kind of guy doesn't mean I can't actually have a trophy in this artificial world. And so that becomes the metaverse. And what it ultimately, like I said, they almost mockingly point to what they're going to do. I was flying back from Europe one time, and I watched a movie that probably a dozen years after everybody else watched it, but it was the movie WALL-E. It was you just have that extra time where I might try to fall asleep while I'm watching something, and and then you got to try to find something that is not going to be offensive or indecent. And so this whole entire thing, like these robot whatevers are there, but the whole earth full of people that have trashed the earth just live in an artificial world, and they're completely complacent by that. Because why? Because there's zero resistance, there's zero effort, they're all these fat slobs drinking giant Slurpees and eating garbage, floating around on a lazy river, pretty much watching a pretend world. And that's what we are as a society moving to. Hedonism is really taking over and controlling, like I said, the entire aspects of society so much, because it is something that is just base passions, zero resistance, zero effort, zero thought process. It's sort of why we said that philosophy largely, and critical thinking and things like that have fallen out of aspect in that first show, is that those things take effort and take work. And we live in a society that sort of shuns that and, wants to create these fat, happy, sloppy people. And that's where, we see hedonism in today's world. So.
Well, and it seems like, Father, I mean, it seems like a good segue. I don't know if you finished talking about hedonism, but I'm really curious now to talk about Stoicism because I think that's, as we're talking about this, I think there's plenty of people sitting here listening and saying, okay, yeah, this sounds, you're right, Father, you're totally right. This all makes sense. So what do we do? So what's the answer? So the answer is to go and not be hedonistic, right? To go and, and give up everything and be tough and strong, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess that's where we go to now.
Right, exactly. So, and that is sort of the Stoic idea. It is the other end of that coin for the large part, because the Stoic believes the practice of what they call virtue, which is not virtue as we understand it, but virtue in their minds, which is logical decision making that is dictated by our will, is both necessary and sufficient to achieve happiness. So again, we see these two ideas, but they're searching after a common goal, but what seems like a common goal, but in the end is actually two different goals, because there's two different understandings of happiness or joy or pleasure or whatever it may be. It is searching after that happiness as a good, but for the Stoic, the virtue is sufficient for happiness. The fact that it is will controlling all of the other aspects of our life is sufficient for happiness, rather than the reward that comes from the decision that we make. The fact that we are able to make the decision is the reward. That is where the happiness comes from. It's like an internalized happiness. And the school of thought started with Zeno of Citium. In this one, I actually have a date written down for it, 322 BC. And so the viewpoint of the Stoic, he looks on at what the hedonist allows to dominate his life: emotions, passions, these base desires. He looks at those things as destructive, and that it is the will that has to dominate all in the decision-making pattern. There was a Stoic named Cleanthes who said that a man ruled by passions is, quote, like a dog tied to a cart and compelled to go wherever it goes. So a man who's controlled by his passions, controlled by his emotions, etc., is like a slave, essentially. He doesn't, just be, the dog who's on the leash, who's tied to the cart. Dogs are pretty happy-go-lucky creatures, and so they kind of dumbly just kind of go around and wag their tail and look where they're able to look and don't really think much about it, but they have zero influence on what they're doing. And so the Stoic recognizes man is greater than that dog tied to the cart. Man has an ability to actually be the pusher of the cart, to be the director of the direction. And so that's the greater end. So because he's able to exercise a higher power than simple base passions and desires, then therefore that higher power being operated itself brings an interior happiness that is better than the carnal rewards of something that comes along. There's another Stoic, Epictetus, who illustrates that on the inverse, the contrast side of that. So we have the first example of the dog. Epictetus says that the Stoic, for instance, is happy because he's free, and that he says a Stoic is sick and yet happy, is in peril and yet happy, is dying and yet happy, is in exile and yet happy, is in disgrace and yet happy. Because whatever these external things are, they are not something that are in the realm of his control. But what he can control, he has dominance over. And so just because he were to catch an illness and become sick, well, he couldn't stop that from taking place. But interiorly, he's happy about that because everything that he can do, he does, that is of good and virtuous action, he does do. There was a Roman Stoicist later on who named Mesonius Rufus, who was exiled from Rome on 4 separate occasions. So he grew up in the imperial, the eternal city, obviously before the time of Christ, so it was pagan Rome. But his own thoughts or actions or whatever it was had him exiled 4 times. But he himself was a Stoic, and so he looked upon it not as a sad thing, but as a realization that man needs very little to live. I had everything in the world in Rome, and I lost everything, my house, my possessions, my whatever it was, 4 times, kicked out and just with the clothes on my back. And what do I need? I need a little bit of shelter. I need a little bit of food, and I am able to survive. Yet I am in exile from the place I loved and was around. But those things, I didn't really need them to begin with, because I'm surviving on these little bits, minimal things. And the very reason that I am here in exile is because I chose to do what I had determined by my will to be the right thing, regardless of if the powers in charge thought it to be the right thing. And so in that free will choice that has led to the punishment of exile, that by itself creates that that interior contentment and happiness. Obviously, with the Stoic, for that then comes this understanding that a person must, in order to be in control of their passions and their emotions, and to keep them subverted for all of their decision making, they in turn have to practice self-control, self-denial, mortification, and even even to take away aspects of pleasure, work hard, and do these things that are necessary to overcome how those lower passions can get in and strike us. So we even get from it this idea of, like I said, mortification and effort and pain at times, to be willing to be willingly undergone, so that we have a better mastery of those lower what their view lower ends in that. So with the Stoic, he recognizes as systematic. He lists 4 things as what he considers passions. Those are distress, fear, lust, and delight. Distress is according to the Stoic, and these have their own Stoic definitions, not just the definition that comes immediately to mind for us, but their explanations of them. So distress is an irrational contraction or fresh opinion of something bad is present, and that somebody is going to think of it like sort of like a depression type of aspect to it. Fear is an irrational aversion or avoidance to an expected danger. Lust is an irrational desire or pursuit out of an expected good, uh, but that good in reality being bad. And then delight is an irrational swelling or greater feeling that comes from a present good. So you have two and two. You have distress and delight, expected bad, present bad and present good. And then you have fear and lust, expected bad, good, expected bad and present good. So, and those contain in them all these varying points of you know, of what would be considered lower functioning things. So like distress, sadness, and mourning, and jealousy, and despondency, and depression, or fear, having shame, or timidity, or fright, or sluggishness, and weakness in that regard. Lust would also doesn't necessarily just mean, you know, what we think of in terms of lust with sixth and ninth commandment, but really focuses on all the connections to the flesh: anger, rage, hatred, wrath, greed, and then delight contains and continues with this idea of rapture or complete sort of showiness and ostentation, and to have that gratification come back at this point in time. And so the Stoic looks upon those things and says, no, we can't have those things making our decisions at all. Our decisions have to be completely devoid of those and simply and purely logical. And so, and it's interesting because we see in that the Stoic actually understands the nature of love, that he doesn't put that in with the emotions. He puts lust as one of the base carnal aspect of controlling carnal desire or expectation. That's controlling carnal expectation is lust, not love, because the Stoic actually recognizes love is an act of the willpower, which, you know, again, we as Christians, also as Catholics, we as Christians, we understand that reality, that love is something that is not necessarily attached to emotions. Seneca spoke of that, and he said, illustrates that by showing how you can get love in your life is by choice. He says that if you want love in your life, then love, commit the action yourself, and then that, and Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor and also a famous Stoic, he says of love, he shows that there is truly a separation between that and the passions. That he says, be free of your passions, but love, because it is a choice, it is an action that supersedes any kind of reward or sensual feedback or anything like that. Love is an act of the will. And so we can see, actually, when we look at the Stoics, that that it is, like you indicated at the beginning, sort of what seems like this, the answer to the problem of hedonism, right? That we're going to have the will control our actions rather than the emotions and the passions. So what's the problem? That seems to be pretty well based in what we as Catholics believe, right? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, is the willpower the higher operator of the person? Yes. However, it is wrong in the fact that it dismisses passions and emotions and the like as evil, as destructive in themselves. Can they be when they're let to be controlling or all running wild? Of course they can be. We showed that with hedonism, but it doesn't mean that our passions or our desires or our affections or things like that, our emotions, that they are bad. And so the Stoic comes off as sort of this, it becomes, their end is too narrowly affected, and so it becomes both very naturalistic and somewhat cold in its reality, where we understand that true goodness and true happiness and the true proper end of that has a combination of the two, that that while that we can see that fear is productive in life at times. Fear can be controlling, and fear can be just destructive for sure if that is a controlling aspect to it. But just because we feel fear doesn't make us weak or bad. It's what we do with it. If there's a fear that comes upon us, that we understand because that this feeling comes first before we realize that it is something that our senses have sort of taken in and put together without a conscious thought, that something feels off here. I feel I'm nervous about something, and it causes us to check around, and all of a sudden we realize, oh geez, I was about, this tree that my ladder is leaning on, and I didn't realize it until I took a look at it, but it's actually not solidly in the ground, and I could have tipped over, or that going into this area, there's there was I didn't realize it, but there's like a bear tracking us or something like that. Like the fact that I should get away from a dangerous animal because it scares me at first. Well, that's very productive, especially in those instantaneous decisions that need to be made. You don't have the time to, you're walking down a trail and a wolf pops out, standing right in front of you. You don't necessarily have the time to come up with the logical conclusion that is going to be the most, fully in command of yourself thing to do. You're going to jump up and go, ah, and that action, just by being afraid, might spook the wolf off and might save your life. But it wasn't a conscious thought. It wasn't a willful made action. And the same thing on the other side of it, that love, yes, is love an act of the will? Of course it is. You love your kids even when they're being bad. You know what I mean? Like you because you choose to love them, and that you're always going to be there to take care, to stand by them, regardless if they've been naughty or not. It comes from this choice of love that's devoid of feelings. However, the fact that love can be supported by emotions and supported by affections and supported by appreciation and things like that, the Stoic would look upon those things as weak. That that a husband would be sensitive for his wife, or that he would dumb things down to be more relatable to his kids, or he would not constantly just be this sort of coldly removed aspect of society because that's the higher end, that it's just I'm always sort of looking to have this logical control of everything, and it's it makes me sort of emotionless because those things are viewed as destructive and weaknesses. And so so it's like you have this phlegmatic existence through the world, that you run over my dog, I'm just as happy as if you came and gave me a lottery check. That doesn't matter because I'm not in control of either one of those things. I'm only in control of what I can do. And so, the logic decisions are what make that create quote unquote happiness. And
Well,
go ahead.
I was just I'd say we have it pretty easy though, as Catholics or Christians, that we can look at Christ, and Christ clearly was not a hedonist and clearly was not a Stoic. I mean, Christ obviously felt just anger and sadness and etc., and clearly wasn't a hedonist. So it's Almost makes it fairly simple for us.
Exactly. So it's, if we look at him as the example, we're going to do pretty good for ourselves. And that's the exact point. Like you said, he wept over the tomb of Lazarus, but he didn't weep for forever. Like he didn't mourn for, and be he didn't become introverted for a year afterwards or something like that. He wept in the moment that he arrived at the tomb, because because that was his friend, and naturally speaking, of course, he was going to raise him from the dead, so that helps a little bit too. But but the reality is, we don't see. We can imagine Christ weeping at the death of Saint Joseph, right? That from a natural point that we can understand, but we cannot imagine Christ being despondent at the death of Saint Joseph. We can't imagine him, crying out like sort of despairingly to heaven. That would be blasphemy, as well as it would be blasphemous to think of him as cold and callous and non-caring about Saint Joseph dying. That like, well, he gone and that's it. That's just when he breathes his last breath, he just sort of gets up and walks back out and continues working on the wood project that they were working on in the carpenter shed. No, we can't imagine that. Just as much as we can't imagine him being, being really melancholic and affected long term that Saint Joseph died. No, he's sad for the loss. He knows that he does take on human form, and so he's like man in all ways except sin. So he does feel the pain of loss that comes from losing his stepfather, his mortal stepfather. But at the same time, he also knows that death is just that reality, and that there is a greater reality beyond that, and Saint Joseph was the just man, and so one day he will see him when he goes to empty out limbo, and that he will be with him forever in paradise. And so there is not this long level of despondency either. It's just the pain of natural loss. And so we see from that more balanced approach, because Christ has given it to us. It's like you said, he preaches to turn the other cheek when we're offended, but he also has justified anger in turning over the money tables and beating out the money changers. So that it's not that his anger in that sense was controlling his actions, but it was facilitating what was a just and right reaction to offense against God and his temple. And so we see that the two actually interact together. And this idea of Stoicism, actually, when we see it, it becomes this. If we see hedonism as making the society effeminate, because it basically is all we consider that effeminate, or because it's based in emotions and feelings and passions and things like that, then we look at Stoicism as this over masculinization of society too, because of that's it's this kind of cold, removed, purely logical, not non-feeling, void of any kind of sympathy, empathy, or affection at all. And so with that, we have this dichotomy of those two ends, and we see by the labeling of them as one effeminizing society and one over emasculating society, that we realize that that's why both aspects, both the things that come with emotions and the controlling aspect of logic, are both necessary, because we are not people that would say that women are bad or men are bad. We understand that God made man and woman, and both are good, and that women, they are more attached to their emotions, and they play a vital and crucial role. That's why they are the heart of the family. It does a lot of good to have that more emotional side to things. And man, that he is the head of the family, and so it is a more logical, more it is necessary for that more devoided, detached, rational look at it. But it doesn't mean that man is purely logic alone and women is purely emotion alone, but rather that we seek out to and find for ourselves a balance in all of that together. That's where like the Catholic ethics comes in, to understand that yes, willpower over passions and emotions, but not devoid of them. That ultimately we do virtue or sin by choice, but at the same time, these things, if used in their proper context, these emotions and passions, they can do a lot to support and facilitate and even encourage those decisions in the future. That we use the good aspects to them to aid us along those ways. And we do see Stoicism in modern society, and we do see this sort of reactionary aspect of it. We talked before the show, and we talked about it a little bit. I sent you an email about it because you were thinking about having a show at some point with some guest on manliness as a virtue, which is great. And that was my recommendation, that you find an old man or older person that you can see that real balance of virtue practice in that person, to go over it, because there's, especially amongst the younger generation, there is this resurgence in reaction to a feminization of society, that we're going to become super manly, type of thing, and it's essentially Stoicism re-embraced. And it's we joked about, it's that you have a mustache, you drink whiskey, and you smoke a cigar, and you think of yourself as a man, and but we do see it. We have these people out there. We have the Wim Hofs of the world that go swimming in Arctic waters. Why? Just because it's like a pure mastery over, his self and anything that is beneath the willpower, that he can be freezing cold for a long period of time, and he's figured out a way to even suppress some aspects of biological responses purely by willpower and training in that way. And that that he's able to carry that out in other aspects of his life, where he's dominant of his decision making, because he can suffer without any kind of real outward appearance of suffering, and he embraces that suffering. We have the David Goggins of the world, who go off and run 150-mile races, and break world records for pull-ups in a row, and basically have these huge long torture fests. Why? Because that idea of, as he says, like embracing the suck, embracing the bad, the pain and all the suffering and everything that goes into these things. Why? Purely so that you can be a better version of you, than you started, better master yourself, and you crushed out weakness. The Jocko Willinks, the Joe Rogans, the survivalists, all these things have this connection to modern Stoicism, and which is what contrasted with this hedonistic society. It's why it is attractive to us, because we do understand that in that practice of willpower, in that decision making being a rational one, and an embracing of things that are difficult for a greater purpose and everything like that, we do see goodness in that. But these things are naturalistic in their focus, and they are not all encompassing. Now, some of them, you might be able to point out, like a Joe Rogan, who, I don't think is devoid of empathy, or, and things like that. I think he can embrace those aspects along with it better than some of the other ones. Anything I've seen on David Goggins has always been sort of like well, I feel like a piece of garbage because I didn't run 700 miles this morning, apparently, and just, break my body down into pulp and projectile vomit everywhere. Like that's for some reason I feel bad about that now. Or I don't, I didn't wake up at 3 o'clock like Jocko to go, to go lifting and stuff. That's, you start to think to yourself like, oh, okay, like, but what is that? It's just like torture without any kind of empathy towards those who aren't willing to go to that extreme as they are. That is there, and it's just they've become in their minds the greater human because they've achieved those things that higher plane than other people. Whereas there is that better seek of balance and possession of virtue on both sides, the feeling and the emotional side, along with the will, that those emotions and those passions and everything work in conjunction with the overarching control of the will, not that we crush them out as lesser goods, lesser things.
Well, it's pretty interesting, Father. There's another story I have from that we have a men's group here in Germany, and it's run primarily by one guy, one good friend of mine. And the group started a couple years ago, and primarily it focused a lot on the physical stuff. And you're going to go out into the woods and learn how to survive. We're going to do this challenge physically and this challenge physically, and all good. I mean, I really nothing wrong with it. I think good, healthy stuff, nothing too extreme. But as the years have gone on, and to the credit of the men, especially to the organizer, it's gotten more and more of a mix of physical and spiritual. And so now you have much more of the guidance of a priest. You have sermons. It's more of almost a retreat with some physical stuff. And it's an amazing thing to have been able to see it in the evolution of it, and to see how it started kind of pretty stoic, but because the men running it were virtuous men and wanted truly just to have a good meeting for men, it eventually evolved into this really nice in between. There's some stoicism, there's some tough stuff, some physical stuff, but also the Catholic spiritual side. And that's been a really cool thing for me to see.
Yeah, that's it. When we look at hedonism and stoicism, really we can understand the stoicism to be the better of the two if we were only given the choice of two, right? Because it is utilizing the higher power of the will, and it is that is the decision-making process. Fine, that's great, and it's something that particularly is lacking in men as in our society today. This willingness to be a bit tough, willingness to not just buckle under any adversity, and willingness to work hard, or willingness to to not make excuses, and all of these things that doesn't become it's too hard, I just couldn't do it, and just like this whiny like shell of a man. No, that's not what is necessary. Your role in life is never going to be this kind of whiny baby aspect, regardless of your vocation. If you're going to be a priest, or if you're going to be a husband, that either one is going to a lot of times take you buckling down and doing the self-sacrificing, the difficult thing, the hard work, labored after thing, for the greater good around you, or the greater good of your family, or the greater, or even for your own betterment. And that's the encouraging thing to see about those type of groups, like your group, that all of a sudden it starts off as, okay, well, we can go shoot guns, and we can learn how to shoot better, and we can learn how to survive and make fire from flint, and we can do these sort of survivalist things. But then on the flip side of that, we turn around and say, all right, well, this week we're going to read a book, and we're going to have the men's club sort of operate in this section as like a little bit of a book club. And then, there's this societal need. So as a men's group, we're going to do the Rosary Novena for this greater good, or something like that, that we're going to take it upon ourselves to actually invest those 54 days into praying for this commonly needed good to come for our society. Or I'm going to share some aspect of some sort of growing moment of yourself as a father, for instance, or when and how to aspects of how to be more attentive to your kids' needs or to whatever. That well-roundedness, that aspect of, it's perfectly okay to, seek assistance when you aren't able or is imprudent to complete something on your own. It's not okay to go asking for assistance just because I don't want to think for myself, or I don't want to, put in the effort or anything like that, and I'll just get somebody to do it for me. That's not okay. But it is okay to recognize in ourselves that we can't do or know everything, and some other people do know better. And so we ask for that aspect of it. Those things aren't weaknesses. That's that all-encompassing goodness that comes along with that. So yeah, it's I'm glad to hear that you have a men's group that tries to embrace those aspects. That hopefully that you can share these type of videos, the philosophy videos with, and say like, hey, listen, in growing intellectually, that is a good end. And so, maybe it's not something that seems like I'm just pounding my chest as like a gorilla, but I'm not a gorilla, so that's I'm a man. I'm supposed to be, increase in intellect. I'm supposed to better myself in all aspects of my life, because that's what God calls, everybody to, is to become a better version of themselves, naturally and supernaturally. So.
Beautiful. Father, I don't know if you have more, but I think that's a perfect way to wrap up a great episode. I think it's another one that just chock full of information. I learned a lot. I think it's really fascinating and really perfectly fitting for our times, as you said, in a very hedonistic society, but and also learning what not to go too far on the other side with the Stoicism. I think that it was a good thing to learn. And I appreciate you coming on, Father. I can't wait to hear what you want to do next. It's always exciting for me. I'll email you here probably in a couple of weeks and be like, okay, so what's the next topic, Father? And I know it's great. I mean, I love it. I know I'm going to be excited about it, because I really appreciate how you do take these things that are, thousands of years old, I suppose, these ideas, but you can make them into, what is going on today and how does that affect society. And I think that's extremely important and needed. And as you said, I think this is something that, how to think and how to understand the errors of thought in today's world. It's a very manly thing for all my friends out there listening.
And I think that just as one last little point is that for the viewers to understand too, that with hedonism and stoicism, that kind of opposite ends of the will versus passions aspect of it, there will be many different schools of philosophy that we go through for these modern philosophical eras that you'll see overlaps in areas. But for this going forward, know that you'll be able to connect hedonism and stoicism, or to one or another error at certain points along the way. It's not, this is not meant that you won't see pieces to things. There's other schools that still embody, aspects of these things. Just like we as Catholics can look at hedonism and stoicism, reject both of them, but also embrace the good parts that are part to them, and so that is, so you will see as we go along different times that there are parts that might seem like, oh, I've heard this sort of concept or aspect or whatever before, but it's part of a different form of philosophy. And just so as a sort of like a heads up that that all different schools, they're not all mutually exclusive. You look at hedonism and stoicism, they almost seem mutually exclusive. That's not always the case going forward. So.
Great. No, that makes sense, Father. Well, I appreciate it. And everyone who, if you did appreciate the show, please like, share, subscribe, comment. Let us know what you thought. Let us know if you have any questions. If you have any questions for Father, maybe go ahead and send them to me first, kevin89davis@gmail.com. I will forward them to Father if they are, of course, appropriate or worth his time. He's a very busy priest, busy man. So send them to me. But comment too. If it's a good comment, then I'll also maybe send it to Father and see if he can give you a response or anything else he can do to help. So, Father, I very much appreciate it again. Until next time, God bless.
God bless you too. Thank you.